everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So today, we're going to be talking about the Spanish-American War and a very important character in American history named Theodore Roosevelt. So go ahead and get started. So you may not be intricately aware of the Spanish-American War. I should clarify, the Spanish-American War is the war between America and Spain. Not to be confused with the Mexican-American War, the war with Mexico, even though they both speak Spanish. So the Spanish-American War is really going to deal primarily with a situation that begins in Cuba. It's going to end with all the monopolies getting knocked down. How in the world does that happen? Well, because of the Spanish-American War, it's going to allow a guy named Theodore Roosevelt to rise through the ranks and become the president of the United States of America, who was fundamentally going to shut down Rockefeller and Carnegie. So there's a lot to get through today. All right. So let me start here with this story on the Spanish-American War and start talking about Rockefeller and Carnegie. So Rockefeller and Carnegie, as I have mentioned in previous lessons, basically buy the president. They basically decide who they want to be the president, and they give them unlimited money so that they can become president, and therefore the elected officials in Congress, the president, they're all pretty much beholden to the monopoly guys. Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, these guys. Even though the Sherman Antitrust Act exists, which says they can't do the things they're doing, there's nobody to stop them. So, this is like known. This is a cartoon from the time period. Literally, like, they are so powerful, it is a known quantity that these robber barons are doing this with the president. Well, just so happens in 1898, when the situation with Spain is going to arise, the president at the time is in his first term in office is a guy named William McKinley. So William McKinley had been handpicked by the robber barons to be the president. As long as William McKinley doesn't mess with the robber baron, he can do whatever he wants. All right. So he's allowed to go be the president as long as he doesn't try to stop the robber barons from being robber barons. So this brings us to a situation in a country called Cuba. So Cuba is south of the United States, about 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And Cuba, they speak Spanish there, so you can kind of infer they were at one point owned by Spain. At this point in 1898, they are owned by Spain. So the issue here in Cuba is that the Cuban people don't really like being owned by Spain anymore. Now, the Monroe Doctrine, as we had talked about a couple units ago, had basically mentioned to the entire Europe, you can't have new colonies over in the New World. This isn't a new colony. Spain has owned Cuba for a long time. Anyway, Cuba tries to rebel and become their own country from Spain. Spain, who has the largest navy on earth at the time with the Spanish Armada, comes over here and to Cuba, the country they own, and puts it on lockdown and says, you're not going to rebel against us. And they stop this rebellion. Now, America typically is sympathetic to countries that want to declare their independence from another country. But honestly, in Cuba, we don't really care. We really don't. This should be the end of the story here. However, as we had talked about muckrakers in the news, all right? Muckrakers were people during the Progressive Era that just talked about the negative stuff in society. It was all true stuff, but it was always the negative. There's a new group that's out now called Yellow Journalists. Yellow journalists are just big fat liars. And they will just lie about anything that they want in order to sell newspapers. And they see Spain as a great place to sell newspapers based on lies they can be saying about Spain. So the yellow journalists start having a field day here with Cuba. They just start lying about all these horrible things that are happening in Cuba that the Spanish are inflicting upon the Cuban people. William Randolph Hearst is the main journalist that's responsible for this. It's all lies. But he is send reporters down to Cuba when they don't find any actual atrocities, because Spain isn't actually doing any of these horrible things. he basically just starts lying in the newspapers and saying like Spain is killing babies and doing all these other just horrific, inhumane things to the Spanish people or to the Cuban people. While it's not true, the American people start demanding that the United States go help these poor innocent Cuban people that are being slaughtered, even though none of that is actually happening. The president, William McKinley, is kind of in the middle of this. He's like, oh. So William McKinley isn't dumb. He knows that this actually isn't happening in Cuba. And on top of that, if he goes and gets involved to help the Cuban people, this is just going to cause a war with Spain. And even though America is confident they could beat Spain in a war at this point, there's no reason to do that. However, William McKinley, as the desire in the United States grows by the American people to get involved here in Cuba, thanks to yellow journalism, McKinley's like, all right, is there anything we could benefit from here in this war if we got involved in Cuba and had to fight Spain? Well, he looks at the stuff that Spain owns because of imperialism. Remember, we have talked about America's taken over Alaska, America's taken over Hawaii. Other countries in Europe have already taken over other stuff as well. If you beat one of those other countries in war, all of their territories, all the stuff they took over due to imperialism, becomes your stuff. So he's like, all right, if we fought Spain, let's see what they got. Now, Spain has some stuff, like, obviously they have Cuba. If we go down to help out Cuba, because the American people want that, there's no way that we're going to own Cuba because the whole point is to help them be free. So we look at what else they have. They have Puerto Rico, which is another small island nearby Cuba. Nothing we really want with that, but we would take that if we fought and beat Spain. Over in the Pacific, on the other side of the world, they have a tiny little island called Guam. Not really something America wants or needs. But then McKinley realizes Spain has the Philippines. Ooh, this is big. So the Philippines is an island chain over there next to China. If you remember, one of the reasons we wanted Hawaii is a refueling station as we were trading very heavily with China. The Philippines wouldn't be used for a refueling station. What America wants to do is take half of our Navy and place it over in the Philippines to basically intimidate China into giving us good trade deals. All right? Because as random as this sounds, your Navy, you never want it on your own coastline. You want it off the coastline. Somehow that helps you defend yourself better with the Navy. Anyway, so once McKinley realizes the Philippines is something he really wants, he's all go time to get involved in the Cuban situation. All right? So, this is Uncle Sam, McKinley at the time, the idea of imperialism. We kind of want the Philippines now, and we're going to use American sentiment in Cuba in order to get involved here in order to try to take the Philippines from Spain. So the question here is, explain how yellow journalism and the Spanish ownership of the Philippines led to American support for Cuban intervention. Basically, how do those things lead to America wanting to be like, yeah, let's get involved here in Cuba, see how this works out. So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. All right, so America never wants to be the one to start a war because that would make us the bad guys. So now that McKinley knows that he wants to get involved here in Spain, he has to get Spain to start it so that America doesn't look like the bad guy. Spain has no beef with America. Why would they do this? But what McKinley wants to do is poke them with a stick until they get really annoyed and lash out at us, and then we can justify that Spain attacked us. So here in Cuba, all right, that he is going to, meaning the President of the United States, William McKinley, he is going to send down into the this harbor here in the Havana Harbor in Cuba, which is where the Spanish Armada is like anchored down. He is going to send one battleship called the USS Maine down there to just see if he can irk the Spanish Armada into a response. Because if the Spanish Armada attack the USS Maine, that's all America needs in order to go to war. So the USS Maine rolls on down there. Spain knows America's up to something because Spain has no beef with America, and they're like, just ignore that ship. The USS Maine's like rolling around, like bumping into other Spanish ships, like, oops, hoping the Spanish will attack the USS Maine, giving us an excuse to go to war with Spain. Spain's not going to do it. While this is happening, simultaneously, William Randolph Hearst, the yellow journalist, he publishes in his paper, and this is completely fake. This is clearly something he typed up himself. Something called the Delome Letter. He claims this, and he's in New York City. Like, he's not anywhere around here. He claims he has intercepted a message from the Spanish military here in Cuba, sent back to Spain, in which it says, Americans are weak. They don't want none of this. And basically talking trash to America. Spain didn't write that. He wrote that, but claimed to America because you could just lie in the newspapers. There's no Google to go verify if it's true or not. So now the American people are even more worked up over Spain because now they're trash talking us. And then, after the USS Maine has just been here into Havana Harbor for 2 weeks, it explodes, killing all the sailors that are on board. And immediately in the newspapers, like William Randolph Hearst, turns around and says, hey, guess who attacked us? Spain. So the U.S. warship was attacked by Spain, blown up. America is furious, and we turn around and we declare war on Cuba. Now, here's where it gets kind of weird and kind of messed up. So, not kind of messed up, it's pretty messed up. It should take us like 3 or 4 days to get to the Philippines, because that's what we really wanted. As soon as the USS Maine explodes, we take over the Philippines like 12 hours later. Meaning, our ships were already there. Our ships were also about to run out of fuel there in the Philippines, and we're about to have to come back unless Spain attacked us like that day. Pure coinkydink, I'm using a lot of finger quotes here, that Spain happened to attack us that day and allowed us to attack and take over the Philippines. It's not until years later when they start pulling up the wreckage of the USS Maine that the explosion was from the inside out, not the outside in, meaning a bomb or some sort of device was detonated from inside the ship. There's a strong possibility America blew up our own ship in order to go to war here with Spain, killing the American soldier. As crazy as that sounds, so bear with me through U.S. history here. There's crazy stuff all over the place. But at the time, there is no question who did it. It was the evil Cubans, all right, and the Spanish. Once again, here's the cartoons. See how quickly we dehumanize a group that we don't like in America? Using racism as a justification for taking lands from other people. So the question here is, what is the controversy or questions today surrounding the actual cause of the USS Maine that brought America into war with Spain? Like, basically, what was the official story at the time of what happened? And what is the kind of today's understood of what happened on the USS Maine? So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. So the Philippines, on the opposite side of the world, we immediately take that. Hooray, we had the Philippines. However, as we go in here to the Philippines, again on the opposite side of the world, we go in with our ships and wreck shop here in the Philippines. Well, now we have declared war on Spain. The whole reason was Cuba, so we have to go down and fight Cuba, fight the Spanish in Cuba. Keep in mind, the Spanish Armada is in Cuba, and they have the largest navy on Earth. So we send half of our navy is in the Philippines. So we only send half our navy down to Cuba to fight the Spanish Armada. Well, what ends up happening is a game changer for military history. As the Spanish Armada starts coming out of these harbors to fight the American military, America wipes out the entire Spanish military in a single afternoon. Sorry, the entire Spanish Navy in a single afternoon without a single American injury. How? Well, I've left out a very important piece of information here. The Spanish Armada is still made of wood. America has all metal ships. And America is able to absolutely wreck shop. And from this point on, any country who had not already committed to having metal ships, steel ships, thanks to the Bessemer process, fundamentally it does it after they realize that a wooden ship cannot do any damage against a modern navy like the United States. So the United States just completely annihilates the Spanish Navy. So hooray, game over, right? No, since America blew up all the ships here from Spain here in Cuba, there's no way for the Cuban soldiers that are still in Cuba to escape because they have no more boats. So the army is still there. So there actually has to be an invasion of Cuba by the United States military. Enter this guy, Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is a special forces guy who's retired at this point. He's a Secretary of Navy. And he loves combat, and he's like super bummed that he knows there's getting ready to be an invasion he is not going to be a part of. You know what? I got to stop right here. This is a picture of Theodore Roosevelt, this guy behind the desk. This is not the first image of Theodore Roosevelt that you need to have in your brain, because he's not a behind the desk guy. This is a much better depiction of Theodore Roosevelt. That's right. He's an actual moose. That's not a stuffed moose. That's a real live moose. So he is an outdoorsy guy. He's really good at what he does. He became the Secretary of Navy. As soon as he realizes there's going to be an invasion, and he's a cavalryman, a man that's on horseback, not mooseback typically, but he's a special forces guy. He resigns his position as the Secretary of Navy, basically in charge of everybody, in order to join the military and be a part of this invasion of Cuba. This typically wouldn't be allowed, but since was just everybody's boss, they let him do it. So he comes in, and since he's special forces, he creates his own group of all the people that he didn't know for a long time. Have you ever seen the movie Expendables? All the all the special forces guys get together. That's basically what Theodore Roosevelt creates here, and it's supposed to be a small group of about 150 guys that go and do special missions here during this invasion into Cuba. He calls them the Rough Riders, right? So these men are all cavalrymen, which means they're mounted on horseback, which is a very important part of the story. So these men are all on horses, trained horses. One trained man on a trained horse is equivalent to 10 men on the ground. Well, as they're going to start preparing for this invasion, they're going to try something new. Instead of shipping everybody down to Florida, where they're going to take everybody, and then train them all there after they have a draft and have everybody sign up for the military, they're just going to train them in their home states, then ship them down to Florida. This is still done today, first time it was tried. However, when they trained everybody in their individual states, and they shipped them down to Florida, when all the people got down to Florida, surprisingly, everybody got sick. On key there. All the people in Florida, they didn't just get a cough like me. They got yellow fever. So the entire army gets sick, and it's because they weren't used to being around each other. They didn't actually get sick from anything in Florida. It was just all the other people around the country. Different people are immune to different things. So they all get sick, and they have to delay the invasion by a few weeks. Theodore Roosevelt says, nah, I'm not going to delay my invasion. We're going now. Now, this is a suicide mission, but because it's Theodore Roosevelt, and he was just a couple weeks ago, in charge of everybody, they're like, okay. So, Theodore Roosevelt and his 150 men get on boats, and they sail across the 90 miles to Cuba to invade Cuba. This is a picture of them invading Cuba. They're missing something here. What were they all supposed to have they don't have? Horses. So these men come across in boats. The horses come across in a specially designed boat for horses, and the boat with all the horses sinks. So now, when Theodore Roosevelt shows up in Cuba, he is here without horses. But this doesn't stop him. Theodore, and this is where the story gets completely unbelievable. If this was a movie, I wouldn't believe it, but this is really what happens. Theodore Roosevelt just starts running across Cuba, fighting small groups of Spanish soldiers, and he keeps beating them. He then gets to a hill where all the Spanish troops are like afraid of him now, and they're barricaded in at the top, and it's the San Juan Hill, and Theodore Roosevelt says, "Last chance to surrender, we're coming up there." There's like 150 men fighting a whole military. This really happened, all right? So they're like, "No, we're not going to surrender." So Theodore Roosevelt, with like no cover and no horses, charges up San Juan Hill to this fort at the top, breaks into the fort in machine gun fire and his Rough Riders on foot, and he beats the entire Spanish military. That sounds unrealistic. I mean, it's the dumbest thing in history in my mind. I still, as a history teacher, can't understand how this happened, but he does. He single-handedly defeats the Spanish military. Interesting enough, he's going to be famous. He's getting ready to be the president here shortly. Shh. Spoiler alert. This is a painting he has made of him running up San Juan Hill. If you notice in the painting later on, he has his horses painted in, but in actuality, it looked a lot more like this, where they're just running up the hill. But Theodore Roosevelt is like an action hero. I mean, this dude single-handedly defeated the Spanish-American, defeated the Spanish military here in Cuba. So the question here is, explain why Theodore Roosevelt, as a cavalryman, did not use his horses in the invasion of Cuba. What did they do instead? They didn't have their horses, so it's literally that. Basically explain to me what happened with Theodore Roosevelt in Cuba, and pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. So, as soon as the war ends, we have to have the Treaty of Paris that's going to end this war. The very first thing the United States does is pay Spain $20 million. Very similar to the way America paid Mexico after the Spanish-American War, the Gadsden Purchase, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where we paid them $20 million so they can't claim we stole the Philippines from them. We bought it from them, so they can't come back and get it. So the Philippines, that's a territory that America wants in order to create a naval base there to intimidate China. So the Philippines, naval base. Cuba gets to be their own country, and we're going to talk about it here in a second. Guam and Puerto Rico become territories of the United States. As of the recording of this, that is still the case. Guam and Puerto Rico are territories of the United States that we still own them today. If America is going to have a 51st state, it is assumed that Puerto Rico would be the 51st state. But that's a whole nother story for another time. Cuba is allowed to be their own country, but they have to agree to this thing called the Platt Agreement, which says they have to give us this is a picture of Uncle Sam basically ordering the stuff off the menu of all the stuff we just gained here from the Spanish-American War, the Philippines and Puerto Rico. And so right here, and I'll back out so I don't block it. This is an area of Cuba called Guantanamo Bay. America says, yes, Cuba, you can be your own country. We want this little piece of land on your coastline for our military, because half of our Navy is going to be in the Philippines. The other half is here going to be at Guantanamo Bay. And they said, just don't ever mess with it. And even though we've had a lot of issues with Cuba, and we'll talk a lot more about it in this course, Cuba's never messed with Guantanamo Bay. That is a naval base for the United States. So half our Navy is stationed at Guantanamo Bay, and the other half is going to be at the Philippines. Which, again, the logic is you don't want it based on your home country. It makes you stronger. So Philippines on one side of the world, Puerto Rico on this side. So why was the Platt Agreement, along with the acquisition of the Philippines, so important for the strength of the U.S. Navy? So pause me, answer that completely, or we're moving on. So you might be thinking at this point, sorry, right here. Pause me here, answer that completely, and we're moving on. So, I started this by talking about how Theodore Roosevelt got rid of the monopolies. What? Like, how do we make that jump? It actually happens pretty quick. So, remember, Rockefeller and Carnegie just gave who they wanted to be the president money, and they would become the president. Well, the issue was that by giving them money, they got name recognition. What really terrifies them is this guy, Theodore Roosevelt. All right. He is now a super celebrity, and as the Secretary of Navy, he might get into politics. He's not a Republican, Democrat. He's really like nothing. So he is a wild card to Rockefeller and Carnegie. So they do not want him to be the president. So what they do is getting ready to be 1900, where McKinley's going to have to run for re-election. If Roosevelt, as popular as he is for single-handedly defeating the Spanish military, if he runs for president, he's going to win, and there's nothing Rockefeller and Carnegie can do about it. So Rockefeller and Carnegie have McKinley go ask Theodore Roosevelt to be his vice president. Because the vice president literally does nothing, and it basically just shuts down this wild card Theodore Roosevelt guy. Theodore Roosevelt hadn't given any thought to what he wanted to do after this war, so when he is asked to be the vice president, he's like, sure. So Theodore Roosevelt's technically now a Republican, as everybody was at this point, but Rockefeller and Carnegie are happy this guy's the vice president, because what can he do as the vice president? Nothing. Things make a very big turn. So in the election 1900, William McKinley wins huge. Theodore Roosevelt's his running mate. Hooray. And then in 1901, there's this World's Fair that takes place in Buffalo, New York. So when this happens, and it's from all over the world, it's almost like the Olympics of new inventions. McKinley is going to show up and just be seen here. While McKinley is there, crazy dude shows up, Leon Chokoff, and he shoots and kills McKinley at the World's Fair because he's a crazy person. And McKinley dies. This is like the only time we've had a presidential assassination, and the people don't care the president died. All they know is Roosevelt's the president. Roosevelt comes in, all right, and Roosevelt is a very strong opinion guy. The guy doesn't drink any alcohol. He's extremely athletic by all accounts, and dude drinks 2 gallons of coffee a day. The dude is hyped all the time. He also wants to do things his own way. He comes up with this idea of speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far. Basically, he says, we're not looking for any problems, but if you bring them to us, we will end it. And he's going to create the world's largest navy. We already had like the world's largest navy. He's going to double it in size and call it the Great White Fleet. So the thing is with him, Rockefeller and Carnegie have no control over have no control over Roosevelt. Roosevelt, while a Republican, the Republicans who are supposed to, kind of listen to what the head Republican, which is the president, tells them, but they're also supposed to be able to control him and kind of tell him what to do. Roosevelt just does whatever he wants. So yeah, he's a Republican, but he doesn't do Republican things. One of the very first things he does is he's like, monopolies are bad. And he enforces the Sherman Antitrust Act. He doesn't even have to make new laws. He just enforces what is already on the books. And he is during his time in office is effectively able to just crush these monopolies and break them up so more people can be successful. Roosevelt doesn't have a political party. He just does what he wants to do. And most of the time in history, we look at it and we're like, good on you, Roosevelt. Created the Newlands Reclamation Act, which basically created a whole bunch of irrigation projects in the West. Lots of national parks are set aside. The reason the Grand Canyon still exists is Roosevelt said, don't have it blown up. He is wildly supported by the American people. All right. The people in Congress hate him because they all basically came in by taking money from Rockefeller and Carnegie. And while Roosevelt is very popular among the people, he is not controllable, and it really stresses out the rest of the Republicans. The best example is his situation with the Great White Fleet. He builds the largest fleet known to man, all right, of these ships, and then he wants to sell it around the world, all right, to all these different countries and let all the countries look at it. Basically as an intimidation factor, like, hey, America, we want to be your friend, but if you don't want to be our friend, we gonna mess you up. So after he builds this fleet and Congress begrudgingly gives him the money to do this, he wants to sell it around the world. And they're like, nope, you can't sell it around the world. We're not going to give you the money to pay for the gas. We won't do it. Sorry, guess you can't. And Roosevelt says, I got about half the amount of money. And they're like, yeah, but you don't have all of it, so you can't do it. And Roosevelt says, you know what? I'm going to do it anyway. And Roosevelt sells his Great White Fleet halfway around the world to all these different countries. And he says, and I tell you what, when I'm halfway around the world and I ain't got no money to bring them back, bet you give me the money then. Otherwise, we just lost our entire Navy. So Roosevelt does things his own way. While he is very popular among the people, elected officials and the Republican Party have no control over him. He single-handedly really spreads out the progressive era, enforces the progressive era, makes life better for working-class Americans while busting up the monopolies. He's going to win huge in 1908 or 1904, and then decides not to run in 1908, and we'll pick up from that story tomorrow. But the question here is, what made Theodore Roosevelt so different from previous presidents, and why did many of the elected officials dislike him at the time, though he was loved by the American people? So pause me, answer that completely. I'll see you guys tomorrow.